Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in to us or with us. Welcome to the pre-conference for the Cultivating Black and Native Futures in Education gathering. I want to share a little background. When Dr. Eve Ewan and I were creating this wonderful time together, we had a list of folks that we wanted you all to engage with more deeply, to be in conversation with and think through. And especially given that a lot of these people that we have as our featured speakers are thinking really intentionally about Blackness and indigeneity. And so with us today at this pre-conference is wonderful people that I hold dearly to my heart. And we thought it would be awesome to have them as our pre-conference, as a way to get us all fired up, to get us thinking about what's going to be unfolding in these next days together. And so I'm just so delighted that you all are tuning in and that we're going to learn from the amazing folks with us today. So I'm going to introduce them, and I hope that you take notes, that you have questions, and we're going to have all of good dialogue after their discussion. So with us today is Dr. Brian McKinley Jones Brayboy. He is Lumbee and President's Professor in the School of Social Transformation and Vice President for Social Advancement at Arizona State University. He is also Director of the Center for Indian Education, and is where I first got to work with him and had the honor to learn and see his amazing leadership, and co-editor there of the Journal of American Indian Education. His research focuses on the role of race and diversity in higher education and the experiences of Indigenous students, staff, and faculty in institutions of higher education. I hold a lot of respect for Dr. Brayboy, and I'm always learning from him. He's not only a remarkable thinker, he has such a generous heart. And I hope that you all will take up his readings if you haven't read his work yet, and find the work that he is able to weave for many of us. Our next speaker is Dr. Jeremiah Chin. Dr. Jeremiah Chin is an assistant professor of law at St. Thomas University. His research focused on the intersections of race, law, and indigeneity, analyzing the school-prison pipeline, Cherokee freedmen, and issues of Blackness, American Indians, and citizenship. Dr. Jeremiah Chin and I also go back on our days working at the Center for Indian Education. I have fond memories stopping by his office and seeing his amazing thinking across the wall, as he's a visual thinker and has his notes all on the wall, like streaming down like Matrix style. And it was always one hello would end up being like a 30-minute discussion, because we would just start chatting and talking about all the things shaping in our lives. So I'm really excited that Dr. Jeremiah Chin is here with us today. We also want to give acknowledgement to Dr. Zabina Vaught, who is professor in the inaugural chair of the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Leading in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. Her book, Compulsory Education and the Disposition of Youth in a Prison School, examines the state juvenile prison schooling system. She will not be with us today in virtual space, but she's with us in spirit, and she has conceptualized a lot of the thinking that Jeremiah and Brian are going to be discussing today. And so I want to just acknowledge her good work and her good heart and being with us today in that way. So the three of them are presenting on a forthcoming book that I just can't wait for it to be released. It's something that they've been cultivating for some time now and thinking about these topics that I just addressed on indigeneity, on Blackness and education so deeply and intentionally. And so we're excited that today that they're going to share with us a bit of their book. And so it gets us excited, gets me excited to hear what they've been thinking about together collectively. So we're going to hear those words today. At the end of their talk, we're also going to be joined by Adrienne Keene. And I'm going to do a brief introduction for her as well. Adrienne Keene is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She has a deep personal commitment to exploring research methodologies that empower Native communities and privilege Native voices and perspectives with the ultimate goal of increasing educational outcomes for Native students. She's also dedicated to pushing back against stereotypes and misrepresentations of Native peoples on her blog, Native Appropriations, which you all should go check out, which is nativeappropriations.com, which has received national and international attention as a voice on contemporary Indigenous issues. She's an assistant professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown Universities. And I'm so delighted that she's going to be a part of the discussion. I want to also give her a shout out because it was through Adrian. We're a longtime friends as well, and she introduced me to Dr. Eve Ewing. And I like to say that she was the conduit to bring Eve and I together to really then do this wonderful engagement with you all. So I'm so appreciative Adrian's going to give time and be in dialogue with both Brian and Jeremiah at the end of this discussion. Before we leave and before I turn the mic over to my wonderful colleagues here, I want to remind folks that tomorrow we have the welcome and the give thanks starting at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. Also, Pacific Standard Time, it gets confusing at the time zone, so I apologize for that. On June 17th, Dr. Eve and I will welcome and thank all the attendees into the shared virtual space that we are convening. So join us tomorrow morning, come on up, or tomorrow afternoon if you're on the East Coast. We look forward to seeing you throughout these next few days, and that we just hope that this lessons and the conversations you have enriches you, inspires you, makes you think about how we can do better of bringing our Black people and Native people folks together in solidarity. With so much gratitude, I extend to all of you and to our wonderful speakers. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brian Brayboy and Dr. Chin. Ahiahat, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ticini, and thank you, Dr. Ewing, for having both of us here today. We're ridiculously excited to be here. Thank you especially to everyone behind the scenes for making such an amazing conference happen. Just looking at the panel and program of presenters, that doesn't happen by accident. That takes a lot of work by a lot of people. And so special thanks to Amanda and Dr. Ticini and Dr. Ewing. As we said, we go back, Dr. Ticini and Dr. Ewing for putting all of this together and everyone behind the scenes for creating it. These kind of conference spaces are in fact where parts of this book that we're going to be reading from actually come from. So Dr. Brayboy and Dr. Vaught and I all started a conversation in 2016 at a conference at Arizona State University Law School on the school to prison pipeline in Indian country. And from that conversation, we started evolving and dialoguing and considering different intersections, histories, and futurities around race and indigeneity, particularly Blackness, indigeneity, Native folks, and prisons and schools that have kind of manifested in this book, partially in conversation with a story and ethnography that Sabina started long ago with a young man who you'll meet in our reading today.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate my thanks to Drs. Ticini and Ewing. So we're going to read to you actually from our book, but let us set the stage for this so that you just have a general overview of the book itself. This book draws on scholarly conversations from Indigenous studies, legal studies, Black studies, and critical theory to consider a concept we call school-prison trust. Rooted in U.S. norms of property and legalized control over land and children, the school-prison trust frames the unique legal and historical relationships among schools, prisons, the state, and Native youth and communities. This trust is not limited to one site of the school or the prison, but is apparent in institutions structured by relationships of control over land and peoples, often masked by seemingly banal race-neutral policies, procedures, and practices. We draw on the wit and wisdom of a then 17-year-old Native Black young man named Jakes. Sabina Vaught's relationship and conversations with Jakes provided us with rich vignettes that showcase Jakes' astute observations of schools and prisons, of histories and futures. His social commentary illuminates the ways that the colonial warfare, boarding schools, and removal are still enacted. In this book, we focus on the specifics of coming for Native children, rooted in the history of trust relationships to deepen and complicate an analysis of school-prison relationships through specificity. In so doing, we open ourselves to possibility, to revolt against the common sense and its materialities, to identify common calls across peoples and ideas, and to consider urgent questions in relation to conquest capitalism, nation building, trusteeship, justice, abolition, and freedom. So we're going to start with really our opening vignette, and then we're going to read sections of the book from you. We will stop at certain sections and then just have conversations with one another in the process. We begin with a quote from Leonard Peltier. "My crime is being an Indian. What's yours?"
Far away from Leonard Peltier, Jacob sat in one state's prison for juvenile offenders. He was 17, an enrolled member of his tribal nation, and had long since left high school on the outside.
Jacob, Jakes, as the other incarcerated young men called him, laughed when Sabina asked him about school one day. They were sitting in the prison school's computer lab, which at the time was used only for life skills class.
Otherwise, it sat empty for hours in dutiful observance of the no internet policy for inmates.
On that particular day, they grabbed a couple of chairs at the small round table that occupied the center of the room, a table from which life skill teachers would comfortably surveil the screens of all the computers lined up along two walls. Jake shifted uneasily at the round table in his cushioned chair. He looked down at the wood top and circular coffee mug stains and adjusted his body repeatedly against the faded green office weave fabric. "Weird, huh?" Sabina said.
"Yeah, man."
And he looked down at either side of his lap, shifting again until he looked up at Sabina and took a nodding breath in.
"Okay."
They both laughed. Jakes was a tall, skinny kid, approaching gangly or perhaps departing from it as he moved towards uncertain adulthood. His face was a portrait of lovely contradictions. Sitting in the life skills room, they talked about video games, fishing, comics, and little brothers. It was a meandering conversation that at one point walked up to the front doors of Jakes' old school. Sabina asked him, "If school was different on the outside, do you think things would have turned out another way?"
"Shoot, nah,"
he said, and he laughed hard. Maybe at school, maybe at the futility of a question to which he thought Sabina should or did know the answer.
Maybe at the complicity of school as a co-author of his Crime of Being an Indian. The answer to the question of Jake's alternate possible futures lies in the problematic U.S. relation to Native youth, expressed in part in the history of U.S. Indian boarding schools. School was, quote, "the last great Indian war," Alan B. Walker writes. "My grandfather, Edward L. Hatchett, was part of the government project to assimilate the Indians into the white man's society. They concluded the only way to save the Indians was to destroy them, and that the last great Indian war should be waged against children. They were coming for the children," end quote. Come for them they did, and come for them they continue.
We understand schools and prisons as a function of U.S. conquest statecraft, as part of a broad and deep war structure of coming for children.
In this book, we focus on the specifics of coming for Native children. This specificity deepens and complicates an analysis of school-prison relationships, and in so doing opens up even more possibility to revolt against common sense and its materialities, to identify a common cause against peoples and ideas, and to consider urgent questions in relation to conquest capitalism, nation building, trusteeship, justice, and freedom.
After the revolution, writes Vine Deloria Jr., the new United States adopted the doctrine of discovery and continued the process of land acquisition. The official white attitude toward Indian lands was that discovery gave the United States exclusive right to extinguish Indian title occupancy, either by purchase or conquest. It turned out that the United States acquired the land neither by purchase nor by conquest, but by a more sophisticated technique known as trusteeship.
For Indigenous peoples in the United States, trusteeship is a complex legal and political relationship, evolving most concretely from the colonial ideologies embedded in U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall's proclamation that tribes are, quote, "domestic dependent nations," whose relation to the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian, end quote. This opinion codified an intractable paternalism of imposed federal trust over native sovereignty. The federal trust responsibility grew from the assertion that Indian nations cannot completely self-govern. Even if their sovereignty is inherent, their governance is dependent and subject to federal superintendence.
Much of the work around the trust relationship centers on governance and control over native land and resources, property rights as defined in colonial law. Trusteeship relies on the creation of property through domination, extinguishing indigenous claims by purchase or conquest to create possessory rights and associated individual rights under the law for white males to own, inherit, and bequeath. Individual rights, domination, and possession are the foundational holy trinity of colonial law. Trusteeship describes the state's perception of its relationship to all that it understands as native property. This relationship is transactional and asymmetrical and unidirectional.
In this propertized schema, children have proven to be among the most valuable property. In describing part of the ongoing practice of trusteeship, Matthew Fletcher and Winona Single write, Indian children remain a primary focus of the federal government's duty of protection, now known as the Federal General Trust Relationship.
Among many other things, American Indian children are actual and symbolic purveyors of indigenous knowledges, future protectors, and potential beneficiaries of land and water, as well as title holders to dual citizenship. Children are possibility. They may become cooperative, assimilated, disruptive, colonial, revolutionary, docile, vanishing subject, nothing of note, or trouble.
They may become necessary labor or surplus labor, or inadequate labor, or revolutionary labor.
What we call the school prison trust is a decisive weapon in the arsenal of the last great Indian war waged against children.
This book considers the rise of what we propose as the school prison trust and its imaginary ameliorative practices of treatment, restoration, and justice in relation to Native youth across contexts.
The School Prison Trust frames the unique legal and historical relationships among schools, prisons, the state, and Native youth and communities. So we're going to take a quick pause for a bit of a dialogue around this. And Jeremiah and I thought we might just kind of talk a little bit about what Jake's and his really insightful commentary and analyses taught us.
It's really interesting because I said at the beginning, this comes from, a series of conversations between myself and Dr. Brayboy and Dr. Vaught. And it was Dr. Vaught who had the initial conversations with Jakes, but both Dr. Brayboy and I have discussed how interesting it is that we feel like we've come to know someone who we've never met, may never meet, likely will never meet, but has such a profound and influential role in our thinking. And he's a very, he's a regular person, right? He's a kid who's trapped in a facility, right? He's not, a published theoretical thinker or anyone like that, but how this wisdom can come from very important, but also less, I guess, socially valued places.
So Jake's, we were writing this actually during the course of this book got written over the course of the pandemic via Zoom with Sabina in Pittsburgh. She was actually in Seattle and then Oklahoma and then Pittsburgh at different times. Jeremiah was in Phoenix and in Miami, and I was in Phoenix. And we wrote this over Zoom and through Google Docs, but I think we were already close and bonded, but I think we bonded to another level really around Jake's, who became a bit of a muse for us. Really his wisdom and hilarity and rawness, I think, drew us all to him. And part of what we've really learned from him, I think, in where we ended up going in this book is really toward a larger idea of refusal. And that's the relationship that kind of comes out of this book. So we're going to return to that notion of refusal. Refusal holds on to truth, writes Audra Simpson. It structures this truth as stands through time as its own structure and commingling with the force of presumed and inevitable disappearance, and operates as the revenge of consent. Simpson continues, when I deploy the term revenge, I am hailing historical consciousness. As such, it is a manifestation of deep awareness of the past, of, for example, theft in raw form.
Conquest institutions necessarily see refusal as insubordination. This can take on the descriptive frames of disrespect or disobedience or deficit or disorder, and have been among the object of entire imperial carceral administrations, including special education or classroom management. And as we tease out in the larger book, refusal resists the imbricate forces of the school prison trust. As Vine Deloria Jr. notes, quote, power cannot be understood outside of its socio-political context. Inherent in the peculiar exercise of racialized peoples on this continent is hidden the basic recognition of their power and sovereignty, end quote. This basic recognition draws a straight line to the heart of conquest apprehension and repression. The state's fundamental recognition of Native power helps map the deliberate counterinsurgent nature of the school prison trust. Refusal brings both Native sovereignty and conquest state apparatal reaction into relief.
One vital component of the refusal of the school prison trust is rooted in Simpson's framing of memory and remembering. It is a memory of the prior, a manifestation of deep awareness of the past, a memory extricated from fictive consensus or evidence, a remembering inaccessible to the victor, a knowing that taps into experiences of the structures that created the current conditions of the warfare institutions, like schools, that led with assimilation and colonizing efforts.
It had been a long time since he thought about having a name. Leslie Marmon Silko, ceremony.
Shoot, no.
Jake said, and he laughed hard.
School is school.
Sabina looked at him with feigned puzzlement for elaboration, but Jakes knew Sabina enough by then to just be exasperated with her. So he leaned back in his green office chair and offered a nonchalant response.
You know, school being just a bunch of people, I don't know, they just trying to fuck with kids.
Coffee mug stains on the table formed a dirty map of overlapping faded enclosures. Okay, Sabina smiled. And as Sabina was about to go on to something less obvious and less annoying, Jakes leaned his sharp elbows onto the wood tabletop for a moment in a gesture of sudden interest or renewed sincerity.
Like they think they trying and everything.
Huh, really? Sabina asked, a little circumspect.
Yeah, like they got this idea once to do this circle. This lady, Linda, she knew all us kids because she was like the top counselor or something. You know what I mean?
Jake saw Sabina notice him rubbing his knuckles. He had large hands and long fingers with protruding knuckles, pretty and knobby. But they were dry from the unruly coldness of this winter, and the large knuckle on his right index finger was cracked and bleeding slightly.
You got lotion?
He asked. Yeah, but it smells, Sabina warned. Cocking his head to the left, he gave her a pretty smile and rolled his eyes as if to say,
Of course it does.
Like patchouli, Sabina followed, grinning, and they both laughed hard at that. Before it was designated contraband, Sabina had learned to bring lotion into the prison because it was one of those both essential and rare commodities. But Sabina had run out of unscented or mild-smelling lotions, and that morning all she had left was patchouli. While a favorite of hers, it was not popular among the young men. Sabina pulled the tube of lotion out of her bag and handed it to Jakes, who squirted a generous portion onto his fingertips and began applying it to his knuckles in funny small circles. So Linda, Sabina prompted them, hoping to return them to this nascent discussion of school on the outside.
Yeah, so Linda's like calling us into the room like it's all special because she has chairs in a circle and man, it was like the Spanish classroom or something stupid, sitting in a circle, like they always think they're doing something native peace thing, but they don't know nothing about being no Indian. So anyways, yeah, we sit there and she's like, let's go around and say who we are. We all know who we are. It's Linda and a bunch of us dudes.
Jakes took a second portion of lotion, capped the tube, and handed it back to Sabina. He busied himself with his small circles.
Thanks,
he said when he was done, and sniffed his hands in the exaggerated gesture of smelling a flower. For a moment, Jake sat back, his hands spread out to dry on top of the wood table, as if laid out to warm in the sun. But it was winter and prison. It was cold, and there was no sun. Jakes cocked his head to one side again, as was his way, and took back to that long time ago, faraway classroom on the outside, where Linda was the keeper of absurdity and power.
So, me being the only Indian as far as I could see in the room, I say, when it comes to me, hello, I'm Squanto.
He grinned, the brilliance of his irony curving up in satisfied wrinkles at the corners of his eyes.
Squanto figures centrally in the myth of Pilgrim and Native interactions, including the childish white story of fantastical Thanksgiving feasts, the story that cleverly blankets the lived white fantasy of Thanksgiving massacres. But Squanto was also a Patuxet prisoner of whites, whose captivity marks one origin in the stories of North American conquest. He was a world traveler, a trader, a double agent, an entrepreneur, a linguist. Squanto is a mystery and what Visner and others would call a trickster, a trope and a man. I'm dying, laughing so hard, but Linda's writing something on her notepad. And later the officer and this guy they brought in to help us take responsibility or whatever they say, Linda says you're being non-cooperative and you're not taking this seriously.
Schools, like prisons and prison schools, are sites of dynamic statecraft, where a young person's crime is being an Indian. Cooperation is used to bludgeon young people in schools into being docile and acquiescent. But being an indigenous person with an untamable sense of humor, one that rebuts the absurdity of conquest power and its keepers while seemingly at their mercy, is a serious, seditious, ideological threat.
Jakes' pushback against one of the countless performances of colonial democracy, a flawless oxymoron, obviously, was one of the worst kinds of conduct for an indigenous boy, non-cooperative. This is the circuitry and the circus of carcerality in the school prison trust, chaotic surveillance of the spirit.
Jakes laced his fingers together, rested his interlocked fists on the table, and cocked his head to the side, shaking it slightly, and looking at Sabina dead in the eye as if to say,
"Now ain't that something?"
To punctuate, he unlaced his fingers and threw his hands up. But when he brought his arms back down, sitting elbows in opposite hands, he noticed his left elbow. He brought it forward to his face, rubbed it with his right hand while looking down at it in bewilderment, and then looked up at Sabina, shaking his head.
Dang.
Sabina was already reaching back into her bag for the patchouli lotion. Here, you'll smell great now, she said, to which he gave a surly face. Jakes gingerly began funny small circles of lotion on his dry elbow. You gonna check the other one before you give it back to me? Sabina asked. He started to say something, but then just gave a look and Sabina laughed.
You think you funny?
No, I think you're funny, Sabina said, honestly. He smiled bigger, then gave her a teenage smirk.
Gerald Visner tells us the features of survivance stories include that they refuse the singular colonial story of war and death. Refusal. He writes, I'm quoting, "Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry," end quote. They are, in his words, an active sense of presence. And they are present memories, wounds of conquest that often live in humor that hides in plain sight as unconquerable joy. They might be sacred, private, secret, and they might also be secular, public, or known. They are wry and incisive analysis. They are individual narrative.
And they are collective intellectual balm. Writing of Jamaica, in particular, violent state incursions into a community, Deborah Thomas shares, quote, "I'm interested in what these wounds and memories tell us. What insights do they give us regarding more general parameters of governance that map the geospatial contours of socio-political and economic entanglements? How might we consider them an archive, not merely of the material traces and performances of sovereignty, but also of the immaterial and affective dimensions of its experience, of what sovereignty feels like?" Jake's survivance stories in this book are an archive of his life in the school prison trust and his collective, contemporary, and ancestral knowings. In part, they illuminate the immaterial and affective dimensions of what sovereignty feels like in the binding contradiction of trust. So Squanto, Sabina said, circling back. Jake's finished circling his elbows.
Yeah, non-cooperative Squanto,
said Jake's, now serious. Putting the top back on the lotion, he looked away into the distance as if trying to see someone, as if thinking about a name.
Squanto, 2 syllables and forced and insurgent transit across the brutal reshaping of the world. Whatever else Squanto was or was not, whatever lore adhered, and whatever exquisite details were lost, he was a real and therefore complex human being who survived among so many things, war capture and slavery, only to finally, miraculously, return home and there find only the ghosts of his entire community. The merciless year was 1619.
The building of empire happens in choruses, not solos, crushing and unbearable. These grief-filled choruses could not travel across the water from the Massachusetts coast to Point Comfort, Virginia, or back, but their temporal, structural coordination was neither accidental nor incidental, just as the carceral relationships of school and prison are both distinct and mimetic across geography, time, and peoples.
So in the process of writing this, I think where we ended up in some really interesting ways, Jeremiah, with Sabina, is really thinking about the temporal and the spatial aspects of this work. You start with Squanto in 1607, 1610, 16 teens, coming back in 1619, but a really thoughtful way of then pulling that through, like the through line of this takes us to Jake's in the present time, and the complexities in which carceral systems travel through time and across context are really important, so that we end up with Jake's as the uncooperative Squanto at the end.
And the way that Jake's is kind of collapsing time with his invocation there too, like I think drew a lot of our attention to it, because Jake's, in presenting himself as Squanto, not only is he playing with like white stereotypes and fantasies around indigenous people, but he's collapsing those structures that appear or make themselves appear to be infinite and timeless to be very finite, right? He's saying that he's been put in the same position as Squanto, and that it's the same practice being repeated just in new and different manifesting ways. And I think that's what's so big and important about and exciting about writing and working in collaboration with you and Sabina and having these conversations, is that we're not only having a conversation between the three of us as authors, but we get to have a conversation with Jake's. We get to have conversations with other authors that we've quoted in the piece, in the book, right? I don't think that I've ever, read or seen conversations between Vine Deloria Jr. and between Cedric Robinson. But then in the process of writing, we get to put these different ideas and theories together in new and exciting ways. Kind of, we mentioned Jake's as a muse, but he's also an inspiration in that way, because he's fusing himself, kid who's been forced into fake native spaces to, announce some kind of disciplinary model in a school, to Squanto, who's been forced into white spaces and then, looked upon for his indigenous knowledge to help save white people on the coast in his time.
Yeah, so I think the other thing is we were thinking about, with the really generous offer to join this lovely conference, was to really think about this gathering theme of futures that Eve and Amanda have laid out in front of us, and what it means to cultivate a future. And I actually feel like Jake's is doing some of that work, and not really by thinking about a linear tomorrow, for example, or even next year, or in his life, but really his sense of just refusing the coloniality of time, linear time in particular, and merging himself in the experiences of Squanto. And so he pulls Squanto from the past and into the present. And I think this refusal is something really important as we begin to think about the future.
And I think the refusal, just to emphasize the point that you were making, the refusal isn't something that he's necessarily articulating or something that he says. He's not saying it's a refusal. He's just doing it. right? And so we have so many activists and thinkers in these spaces that just do the work. And so I think it's just important to listen and take note. And so I think that's also part of the process, is that we're talking about a conversation between these scholars and these people and us and Jake's. But one of the most exciting pieces of a conversation is listening, and being able to listen to others and hear what they might have said might say to each other, what they might say in response.
Yeah, and I just want to point to another piece of the theme of one of the themes of this conference, which is joy, right? And I think that Jake's ends up being able to manage humor in a really dark and dreary place. That is a prison in the Northeast, where it can often be dark and cloudy and dreary, and yet he conjures this joy of spirit. I mean, part of the refusal in some ways is the fact that he maintains some joy and it's certainly not happiness, but some joy, and finds some joy in tweaking people, but also making some really interesting critiques of what's there. And so he and Sabina, it's interesting in thinking about the way in which she writes about their interactions, with how much laughter is punctuated in the midst of it. So I think she's bringing some laughter there. He's making her laugh and think, but joy becomes really important. And I think it's such a crucial thing for us to be thoughtful about. How do we create the conditions for joy? And what do we do with humor? That's part of the power of trickster discourses, is the fact that there's joy and really some complicated ways of thinking about humor embedded in that.
And I think that the practice of refusal that Jake's does, I think, gets us back to this notion of possibility, right? Refusal opens up new possibilities by just refusing the way things are, right? He's refusing the carceral system of punishment, and instead opening us up to possibility of futures, of joy, of my favorite terming of it is when Kiese Layman talks about abundance, right? Mm-hmm. Jake sees abundance in a situation that would otherwise be deemed finite. And so that, how does he find that? What is that creativity? There's something really remarkable about that practice.
So I think the last thing before we sort of go on is to really think about how do we begin to think about this larger question of what educational futures might be. And people may find it interesting that we spend so much time thinking about lotion being rubbed on raw, knobby, in Sabina's words, beautiful, bony knuckles and fingers. But it's really, I think for us, the way I've come to understand this is that we often pass over these fairly mundane moments. And yet it's the knowledge in there that happens. It's the Jake's rubbing lotion in his hand that he doesn't like the smell of, where he begins to unpack some very important truths. And so I think for me, one of the lessons from this, and talking with you and Sabina, and us thinking about Jake's and his wisdom, is there are powerful moments in the seemingly mundane, which I think is just crucial to us, which forces us and calls us to think about how do we listen and how do we hear the wisdom in people that we may have just passed over in other times in the busyness of life. Shall we get back into the reading?
Let's do it.
Jake's invocation of Squanto was neither accidental nor incidental, but rather mournfully analytic, precisely satirical, and brilliantly refusing, reaching across geography, time, and peoples. Names come to represent more than the sound. They carry the actions of that person across time and into communities. They form a pushback across colonial systems intended to remove or annihilate the essence of people. They become one and many.
While Jake's story's structural or legal antecedents can be found in the doctrine of discovery and white property as frame and photo of trusteeship, its expression proceeded in schooling and its liberal state war projects.
Putting narrative form and cadence, embodiment and name to Simpson's analytic, Jake's and Squanto's revenge mobilizes an historical consciousness, avenging prior and present, prior and present, pointing choral adolescent ghost fingers fiercely at the unbroken link between the prior and the present, contributing to an archive of what sovereignty feels like in the school prison trust.
And what it feels like is in part the doing of it, making an alliance of the philosophical with the active. Operationalizing sovereignty, Jake's self-determines refusal revenge against institutional educational efforts to extinguish agency. Notably, his revenge tactics play on the colonial stereotype of traditionalism, and so upend both the current context and the framing of past as antiquity in forging an insurgent future featured by will and survivance. This is temporal sedition. Jakes and Sabina sat at the table for a bit, her thinking about Squanto and names, him thinking about something she didn't know. Then he slowly broke the silence.
Yeah, inside, they just tell me over and over again, I got an anger problem. That's why I did stuff. Anger. So I got to work out my anger or else. I'm never going to get out of this place.
This place was a prison. It was a prison called by another name, a treatment center, a place in trust of trust. And the prison's primary form of treatment was school, forced boarding school immune to the resistive possibilities of law. He was removed into the new school prison trust. He was in the care of a more sophisticated technique. While Jake's initial sentence was set by a judge and was set at 10 months, his clinician had extended his sentence without judicial review 3 times. Leonard Peltier said, "My crime is being an Indian." What happens when a subjugated native crime of existence becomes an individualized psychological, quote, problem? Anger. When secondly possessed indigenous youth criminal conduct becomes non-docility, non-cooperation.
What happens when the punishment for breaking the law is to be subjected to treatment? Is Jakes' crime being angry, refusing to cooperate, being Squanto? Is it found in being the object of trusteeship?
Jakes turned to Sabina and said,
"This whole setup is racist. Even me being angry. Like I'm some angry Indian running around because I beat up some white dudes. They was punks. True. Real punks."
Sabina nodded. Jakes nodded.
So?
Jakes unlaced his fingers, propped his elbows on the table, and cradled his face with his hands.
So now I'm supposed to be sorry? I'm supposed to ask them to forgive me, and I'm supposed to think I got an anger issue?
Questions about respondents or responses echoed throughout our many conversations. They echoed throughout sites of benevolent captivity where punishment was treatment and the supposed pathology being treated, the crime. He leaned back, dropping his hands in his lap.
Yeah, I'm angry. Shoot.
Silence joined us, and when Jakes finally spoke, it was in a near whisper, so as to not disrupt the quiet or wake of the jailer.
I'm supposed to say, "I'm sorry I hurt you." I ain't sorry. I sure ain't sorry.
Tomorrow, I'll bring some shea butter, Sabina said.
Can you put something Indian in it?
For Jakes, one of the clear futures of treatment and state restorative justice was contrition. For a Native young person, contrition is structurally built into the trust relationship as forced acknowledgement of unfitness for self-governance. It is an admission of willlessness, organized by legal doctrine of individual will. In other words, the trust relationship, in part, requires Native nations to be in a constant state of compelled apology for being unredeemable, failed civic subjects. The derivative construction of Native people is fastened to vast racial capitalist structurings. In her timeless reflections on the object of being property, Patricia Williams considers the ways in which meanings of being human are made within the quote, 4 corners of the contract. She writes, one of the ongoing features of racial oppression, quote, is a belief structure rooted in a concept of black or brown or red anti-will, the antithetical embodiment of pure will. To be perceived as unremittingly will-less is to be imbued with an almost lethal trait, end quote.
Jakes' willful critique of apology takes on added meaning in his context, as indigenous youth's willfulness is always also an assertion of self-determination. Specifically, his assertion is a refusal of the conditions under which there was a demand for apology. Apology requires interdependent relationality. It requires a general agreement, arrived at through generative, theorized communal balances of difference on the conditions and norms, the protocols and conventions that preceded the harm. But conquest itself is incessantly reformulated through an exhaustive, revisionist amnesia that requires a refusal assertion of self-determination. The call for Jakes to apologize is both a demand that he mollify the violent conditions imposed on him and a ransom against his anger.
Jake's apology would be evident that he is but a fractional reflection of the veridical fantasies of conquest colonialism. In self-determined life, interdependence, independence, and trust are of a piece. But in the US political context, trustful relationships are exerted over, not engaged between, and produce moral mandates on behavior that pulverize the spirit as they impersonate humanization. Outside conquest, trust inheres in independence and interdependence in trust. But a life free of interference or control is precluded from the school prison trust, or the larger governing trust rubrics as they stand. In spite of tribal nations' considerable longstanding efforts to the contrary, trust is shaped by dominance and control.
One need not look further than the fact that the dissolution of trust is the extermination of nations, just as the demand that Jakes apologize is a steel-jawed snare in the larger hunting down of his ontological condition. The hunting party's aim is to capture his being and leave in his place a colonial substitution to make a carcass of the essence of the man and reshape it with a taxidermist's nimble simulation. One so docile that it can be mounted on the wall with other artifacts of conquest. The apology attempts to reframe his existence into a trophy.
In this light, Jake's refusal highlights a poorly kept secret of carceral conquest states. State-orchestrated human rights projects are repressive projects. Trusteeship is founded in notions of white benevolence, as well as a negative sovereign right and a negative human right.
On the one hand, Jakes recognizes that he cannot summon justice because it never existed in conquest, and yet it is a figment of its imagination of the lexicon of its grammar. On the other hand, he can summon Squanto and all the real worlds he awakens. Jakes' invocation of Squanto in Squanto's homelands was insurgent historiography. Between himself and Squanto, Jakes conjures the interdependence of time, place, and history.
He is a Janus historiographer. He gestures to the only possible conditions for justice, those that are free of the grip of conquest relationships. And then we wonder, would justice make sense? Freedom emerges out of reciprocity and abundance in resistance to conquest, as does refusal. In the context of conquest, justice is a struggle toward. It never was, but it also is not the end game. As with abolition and in relation to abolition, it is a process framework, one that calls on imagination and insists on radical change.
Yeah, so you've already mentioned the fact that we put really interesting people in conversation here with each other. You've got Vine Deloria Jr. and Audra Simpson and Gerald Visner connecting with people like Cedric Robinson and Patricia Williams and Robin Kelly when we think about these larger notions of freedom. I also think there's something really important in that and in this previous section that we've read and where we kept coming back to, which is the importance of relationship. Like, what do we do with relationship and how do we begin to pull it apart? I mean, I think Jakes' critique of restorative justice is really important because he's essentially saying we're not in good relationship. I can't see these boys that he fought with were punks. And I think in that he's really sort of situating them in relationship to one another, and the fact that he continues to be renewed and being in prison is in part a refusal of a particular kind of relationship that is transactional, right?
And I think that relationship piece is so important to it too, why we kind of centered the school prison trust at so much of this work is looking at what does it mean to be in relationship with the state in all of these multiple ways, right? The school is a relationship with the state in many ways. The trust relationship is another form of relationship. But how are these relationships also shaped by the ideological underpinnings of those relationships? And so for us, I think that's what the refusal and all of these different conversations highlight, is that we're all seeing different pieces of these relationships. So I think part of what makes this conference so exciting too is now we're assembling the pieces. And when we see all the pieces together, it's like, putting together a jigsaw puzzle, right? And we can see how it fits together.
Yeah, and I think part of what Drs. Ticini and Ewing have invited us to do is to rethink, reimagine, maybe return to the original relationships between Black and Indigenous peoples. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff you and I are working on as an Indigenous man and a Black man around larger questions of indigeneity that we shouldn't get into here. We'll get into some other point. But I think, how do we rethink relationships and relationality between Black and Indigenous peoples? How do we move away from anti-Blackness? How do we move away from a romanticized notion of what a Native is and how that gets taken up in some of our communities? And how do we move forward in a call toward freedom and abolition? I think we're moving from abolition to really thinking seriously about freedom and sovereignty in relationship with these relationships between, in the instance of this conference, really Black and Indigenous peoples.
And I think what Jake highlights so much for us is that maybe the start of that conversation is in refusal, and refusing to that. Maybe the most basic form of refusal is just refusing to accept things being the way they are, or refusing to accept that they've been that way or will always be that way. And that initial place of refusal opens up limitless possibilities that I think that Jake's, inspires.
Let's return to Jake's, shall we?
Let's get back to it.
The outer bands of the hurricane were moving in all over us, all around us, beautiful white feathers from a satellite. They were in reality gusty scouts, marking a path for decimation, alerting everyone on the ground too late. Inside the prison social studies classroom, no one was the wiser. The unpredictable, angry banging of the radiator hoarded the sound waves for itself. The windows, set back behind metal bars and full of whistling leaks, were also covered with a jaundiced, chipping layer of metal mesh veneer. The veneer's small peeling apertures onto the outside were grimy and no match for the scope required to see the enormity of a coming hurricane. The social studies teacher, Roy, got excited by the memory of the morning news and interrupted a fierce chess match to boyishly exclaim,
Guys, there's a hurricane making landfall tonight. I'll be at home watching the game, but you all will be here.
He was the worst kind of coward. The young men turned from their match almost as one and stared at him in collective wonder about what even to say or not. Then, possessed by his indomitable wit, Jakes jumped up and assumed the open space in the classroom right in front of Roy's desk.
A hurricane? No, not a hurricane.
Jake feigned seriousness.
Bro,
he said, shaking his head at Roy. Jake spread his feet in knockoff Nike slides, easily 3 feet apart, his 2 big white socks hanging off his toes and heels. He shook his long, gangly legs as if loosening up and situated his pants.
Roy, I got to dance for the hurricane.
He turned around.
Yo, Game, hit it.
And Game, who was always slow to catch on, for some reason caught on right away and began air DJing and moving the record back and forth on the invisible turntable. We could all see it clear as day. Jake started with his arms and his feet, and we all started laughing. Amani started cry laughing and said,
Dude, that's the dopest, funniest shit I've seen in forever.
It was a moment of uncontainable joy. Roy, ever uncomfortable, asked,
What is it?
Quickly, Jake's paused legs in position. He stared wide-eyed at Roy. Solemnly, he placed his hands in an X across his chest, lowered his brow as far as possible, and lifted his chin slowly and slightly.
My ancestor, Squanto, invented it special for the pilgrims to help them fight hurricanes.
Jake's paused for emphasis and flickered his eyebrows up as he set his eyes even deeper in a lock with Roy's.
He called it the Cupid Shuffle.
And then, to the joyous chorus of unstoppable sobbing laughter and lyrics, he broke into the best Cupid Shuffle Sabina had ever seen, before or since.
Audra Simpson illustrates that refusal is a symptom, a practice of possibility for doing things differently, for thinking beyond the recognition paradigm that is agreed upon antidote for rendering justice in the deeply unequal scenes of articulation.
Jakes did not seek himself in Roy's gaze. He blurred Roy's gaze.
And then directed it into crisp focus. Certainly, he refused Roy's cowardice and Roy's threat.
He refused fear of the imminent and inevitable, guaranteed in the coming of the Behemoth storm.
And he refused Roy's narrative authority over those.
Powerfully, he refused Roy's conquest assumption that he alone could shape truth and feeling, knowledge and its denial. Jakes made Roy a pitiful, weak, and frightened pilgrim, a foolish audience and a total outsider. Counting coup on Roy, Jakes turned Roy's gaze back on himself, flipping recognition. Roy was the subject of his own derision, a subject that withered against the Cupid Shuffle. He did not ask Roy to recognize him or Squanto or indigenous life.
In the Cupid Shuffle, the pilgrims in Plymouth Plantation cower, even if for a moment. Jakes creates community of joy, expression, knowledge, and banishes Roy from it. He recognizes himself and Squanto, Game, and the other young men, and refuses to recognize Roy, an agent of the carceral conquest state.
But what exactly or how exactly did Jakes do what he did? What does refusal feel like? We start with joy because the mockery was at its apex, a hilarious creation celebration deliberately crafted for collective freedom that in prison is insurgently eruptive in character.
It was a particularly dazzling mockery because in it, Jakes marshaled a caricature lodged deep in the colonial psyche, anticipating and recalling the world-making ideology of the school prison trust.
The indigenous inhabitants of North America, writes Lewis Owens, and I'm quoting again here, can stand anywhere on the continent and look in every direction at home, usurped and colonized by strangers who from the very beginning laid claim not merely on the land and resources, but to the very definition of natives, end quote. As Jake stands in a prison classroom and looks into the face of the teacher man, who with Linda and myriad schooling others lays claim to the very definition of natives, he mocks Roy with the fatuousness of his own racism, his own fear, his own threat.
He illuminates the banalities conquest agents inhabit. He frightens Roy in the full freedom of his comic joy and his command of us, who laughed and sobbed, then and now, in part by calling on ancestors, merging the real and white imagination, and so stealing back what Roy thought he knew was a thief by trade and by tradition. But Jakes was also refusing as creating something else entirely. Everyone thought Jakes was Black. He was Black, and he was Native. Everyone thought so. At least the young men did. He was Native and he was Black. And
a little bit of some kind of white somewhere in me.
That's all nothing new or surprising or unusual. But there was a rupturing dimension to what he said. He was not seeking recognition from anyone, and yet from many, but on self-determined terms.
Why I gotta pick? Like, why do these oh, oops, sorry. Why everybody think like you Black with an Indian granny, or you Indian and your people got it with some slaves or something? Like, what is you really?
And his really was multiple and synergistic. He described himself as recognizably, physically, and aesthetically Indian, and without contradiction, as similarly Black. He identified with communities, cultural practices, politics, ancestries. Deborah Thomas writes, race is not something certain bodies possess. Race here is not an elective identity marker, but a historical, structured, and relational experience. This experience, of course, is grounded in local landscapes of power and aspiration, themselves structured by the specific colonial histories that imbue those landscapes with significance, end quote.
Our role isn't to interpret identity, to say what Jakes is or what anyone is, a condition some think is the purview of a nation, and others the purview of a cultural community, yet others the dominion of science and biology, and still others the domain of our relations with a divinity or our ancestors, but rather to consider the broadly complex vectors of refusal and self-determination. And moreover, what Jake's particular practice reveals about possibility is the carceral context of trust. In the Cupid Shuffle appears an invocation that says indigenous does not have to be boundaried and also does not have to be all things and so nothing.
Indigenous is Black and Native, is time, culture, politic, and place that refuses conquest colonization and refuses historic purity forged through historic lies. Jake's Black Squanto, not simply phenotypically, archivally Black, but culturally, actively, politically, presently Black, commands consideration and authors new histories.
Jake's cohabitation of identity is anti-colonial practice. In it, Jake's invokes Squanto in name and Fanon in practice. I'm quoting here, what Fanon alerts us to is how the act of disciplining of thought, the process of habitually delimiting what we know about Blackness according to colonial perimeters, stabilizes race and perpetuates anti-Blackness, end quote. And the process of habitually delimiting what we know about indigeneity through conquest parameters achieves anti-indigeneity. What is you really? Is the anemic lifeblood of trusteeship, conquest life supported, nursed along by coerced and collusive transfusions, quantums and one drops and enrollments and recognitions and missing and murder. Purity and its antitheses, dilution, fractionalization, contamination, are imperial fictions that have long been embedded in the legal structures of the US and the concomitant ideas of peoples, less than a whole, reduced to a hand, as Natalie Diaz reminds us.
Dismembered, as Wilkins and Wilkins illuminate. These disciplining forces of thought pump the very heart of trust and are parts of its desperate invention. They write the DNA of unfreedom, but dilutions and fractions are diasporic conditions, and diaspora is not simply a condition of having been scattered, but rather one of possibility, generativity, invention, and freedom.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremiah.
Thank you, Dr. Brayboy.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Brayboy and Dr. Chin. That was incredible. I feel like in a lot of ways, the virtual format doesn't allow all of the feelings that we feel as you're speaking. I was laughing hilariously with Jake's comments, like just totally getting his remarks. And I'm sure many people listening were cracking up as well. So just sharing that there's feelings that we're feeling. And in your words too, I love how you frame sovereignty as immaterial and as effective, because I acknowledge that I was feeling your words so deeply. There was portions in your talk where my heart was starting to race faster and I could feel it. I was more aware of my body and my chills were in my arms right here. Just in terms of the power that you're allowing us to feel in terms of Jake's story and how this idea of refusal and how it's just so magically powerful as a weapon and the way that we can use that to take up, as Audra Simpson says, this person says this about me, this person says this about me, this person says this about me, but I don't give a shit what that person says about me. I'm going to be who I am based upon that. And how that's just a powerful weapon that she has. So many wonderful comments I just want to share, like words that just stuck out to me. Refusal as just always doing something. This idea of futures was so beautifully woven throughout as refusals as a weapon for futures. The interactions that you all had in your talk, this weaving of this cadency of your response and the story, and how you gave life to Jake in that way, both of you, was so powerful. And I just want to thank you for being creative in that way, because I can tell it took a lot of thinking to be switching it up, having discussion, and the amount of energy and time you did that allowed us to be connected to you and the work that you're doing. So bravo on even the process thinking and the delivery of your talk today. And this idea of possibility, reminds me of what Dr. Eva Ewing and I have been sharing a lot. It's kind of like a little inside joke, but we always say, you never know. I mean, in terms of this conference, of it just like, let's try it. We never know, and that's kind of our lingering text. Like, should we do this? I don't know. Let's try it. You never know. This idea of possibility is we don't know. But this idea of engaging and doing something through refusal, through joy, is a process of moving towards the knowing, to the know. But we recognize that we don't know what's gonna happen in an hour or so, but we can do our best. And I love how you said that, the possibility. And I want to also acknowledge the powerful moments that you said in the seemingly mundane, the everyday things that I think we take for granted that has happened in our lives. Particularly, I feel like for me after COVID, I'm more aware of the mundane, the everyday. And not to say I wasn't aware of it before, but I feel like there's a deeper awareness. And I think that what has COVID can teach us is being thoughtful of that. And this idea of it's being really present, but the presence, as Leanne Simpson would write, really listening, those skills of listening and taking note. It's a spiritual practice for me because it's not easy for me to do, but it's something I feel like what you said is so powerful. And the lotion, there was so much teaching and beauty in that moment amongst Jake and Savina. So much wonderful things. I cannot wait for your book to come out. Thank you for offering your words with us and getting me pumped up. And I hope many of you out there are just as excited I am, and we're laughing and feeling those good energies in your body. So thank you so much, Dr. Chin and Dr. Brayboy and Dr. Vaught. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to actually turn the mic over to my good friend, Dr. Adrienne Keene, who's going to be in dialogue with you all, and also dialogue with those of you who are listening in. So have your questions ready. If you haven't already posted on the Q&A, drop it in there. We want to have a dialogue. Ask them questions about the book. Ask them questions about the process. Dr. Brayboy loves talking about the process and how they wove 3 stories over Zoom, right? That's a lesson. There's so much lessons in that as well. Share that. And thank you both for your time and your intelligence and all the families that you bring into this time with us together. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.